So I want to welcome you to this webinar about doctors and lawsuits. I'm a physician myself, and what I can tell you is that this topic speaks to the heart of darkness for doctors. This is something that keeps doctors up at night. Lawsuits are a known worry, and they have certain implications for doctors. One is, if they're sued for medical malpractice, some patient is telling them they're not a good doctor, plus there is the risk of the financial consequences. So I'm going to tell you some personal stories, including the story of my own lawsuit. I'm going to be talking from my experience as an expert in medical malpractice lawsuits, and I'm also going to be speaking about somebody who has an intense interest in doctors and their relationship with money. I've written a couple of books about doctors and money, and this is something that, is part of my day-to-day experience. So what I am not is I am not a financial advisor. I don't give financial advice, nor am I a lawyer. I don't give legal advice. So think of this as sort of a cultural anthropologist taking a look at the experience of being sued. If you're a financial advisor, what you can do to proactively help your doctor prospects or clients. And if you are a doctor, what you can do to decrease the risk of being sued and to know what to do in the event that you are sued. So let me just start off with a personal story. This happened about 25 years ago, but I remember it as if it were yesterday. So I was in my private practice. I'm a surgeon, and it was one of those rare evenings where I was actually home for dinner. So my husband and I were sitting at the dinner table, which looks out over our front yard, and we see this guy back into our driveway, leave the car running, and come and ring the doorbell. Well, my husband went to answer the door, and the guy says, I need Dr. Rackner. So my husband calls me down. I go to the front door. He said, "Are you Dr. Rackner?" I said, "Yes." He hands me an envelope and says, "You have been served." And we watch him run to the car and take off from our driveway. So we go back up to the kitchen table, and I open it up, and it turns out that I was being sued by one of my patients. Now, I remember this patient really well. He had come to me on a Friday afternoon. He told me this long tale of woe about how this doctor and that doctor had let him down. And I thought, wow, this poor guy, he needs a break. So I'm going to take really good care of him. And I went above and beyond, really above and beyond, to give him extraordinary care. And this is my thanks. And as I was thinking these things, my husband had picked up the lawsuit, the paper, and he had seen, wait a minute, you're just not being sued. It says your marital community is being sued. I'm being sued too. And then he started going on about how he knew that, it was going to require sacrifices on all our part, including his part, for me to become a surgeon. We had just bought this house. He had a business, and he said, "You mean we could lose everything because you're a doctor?" Well, it was late at night. I couldn't get my medical malpractice carrier on the phone, so we had that night to worry about this. And it was a huge, huge worry. So first thing in the morning, I called my medical malpractice carrier. They told me that, I shouldn't talk with anybody, that they would be behind me, that I would get a lawyer, and they would be there to walk me through this process. Well, this process for me lasted about 2 years. We prevailed. The judge finally found in our favor. But when the lawyer told me about the court's finding, he said, I've got some good news and some bad news. The good news is that we won. The bad news is that with lawsuits, Even if you win, you lose. So we're definitely going to talk about medical malpractice, and we're going to look at the numbers, how many doctors are actually sued, what happens, what do doctors really have to fear? But what I'm here to tell you is that the really scary stuff for doctors is not the medical negligence. It's the personal injury stuff. So let me just give you an example. So there was a dermatologist who had been very successful throughout his career. He had put away millions of dollars, but he continued to see patients because he loved seeing patients. Well, he sent one of his office staff out to get sandwiches for the staff for lunch. Unfortunately, this woman got in a car accident. She was in a T-bone accident and a teenager was killed. Well, everyone was insured, but still there was a personal injury lawyer involved in the case. And he found that, she had been off sort of on practice business, getting sandwiches for the team. And so he sued the dermatologist, and the dermatologist lost everything. So this is really one of the things that doctors should fear. Now, what's the difference between a medical malpractice lawyer and a personal injury lawyer? Well, a personal injury lawyer wants to get the award, right, the judgment. And so as they think about whether or not they take a case, which is often on contingency, so they don't get paid unless there's a judgment, one of the first things that they will do is go and see if the assets are available. Doctors are known to have deep pockets. And so if, like the dermatologist, the assets are just out there, easy to collect, they're more likely to say yes to the case than if it's harder to get to that judgment. So I'd like to talk about both kinds of cases, and I'll share with you, ways that you as a financial advisor can help doctors, can talk with doctors about this. And if you're a doctor, what you can do with members of your dream team in order to decrease the risk of these things happening and also decrease the financial consequences should you be sued. So let us start out with medical malpractice, because when people think about doctors being sued, this is where they normally go. Well, I have been an expert in medical malpractice lawsuits. And by the way, if you're a doctor thinking about, alternative revenue streams, I think that this is a great activity. I think being an expert made me a better doctor. All right, so in order for the plaintiff to prevail in a case of medical malpractice, they have to prove three things. First of all, there was a violation of the standard of care of a reasonably prudent doctor practicing in that community. Second, the patient was harmed. And third, the violation caused the harm. And all three of these elements must be satisfied. So before a lawyer takes on a plaintiff, they usually have an expert take a look at this case and decide, what are the chances of this lawsuit being successful. So, I'll just give you a personal story. So I was just at the nail salon, very nice Vietnamese couple, runs this little business, and Vivian's husband, Sam, wasn't there. So I said, Vivian, where's Sam? Because Sam's always there. She said, well, I will tell you, but I might have to cry. Sam is home, recovering from almost dying. So Sam had some pain in his belly that started getting worse and worse and worse. When Vivian woke up at about 2 in the morning and Sam wasn't in bed, she saw he was lying on the floor in pain. So she rushed him into the emergency room where he was diagnosed with presumptive appendicitis. He sat in that emergency room for about 10 hours before the emergency room decided that they didn't have a bed. You know, they were full with COVID patients. So they had an ambulance come. He was transferred to another hospital where he sat another 3 hours before he was finally taken to the operating room. By that time, his appendix had ruptured. He had, you know, contamination of his whole belly, and he was in the ICU for 3 days before he was finally sent home. Now, appendicitis is normally about a 24-hour illness. So you've got about 24 hours between the time that you first experience pain and the appendix ruptures. Well, that 13-hour lapse probably led to the rupture of this appendix. So had he been taken to the operating room from the emergency room, he probably would just have had an overnight stay and he would have gotten back to his life and his business a little more quickly. So a reasonably prudent doctor knows that appendicitis needs to be attended to quickly. He was harmed because of this. So he had extra hospital expenses, he had extra time off of work, and he had this harm because somebody violated the standard of care. So technically, Vivian probably could sue this hospital. She probably won't. But what I told her is that at the very least, we could go to this first hospital and tell them that they are responsible for all of her hospital bills. And I offered to help her. This is actually pretty difficult to prove. So let's just talk about the numbers. Every year, Medscape releases all sorts of really, really interesting studies, including medical malpractice reports. Now, you can actually get access to these reports by signing up for a free Medscape account. But I just want to walk you through the most recent data that we have from 2019. All right, so the headline is, you know, if you are a doctor who has been sued, you are not alone. About 6 out of 10 doctors will be sued in their careers. You're more likely to be sued if you are in a medical specialty rather than primary care. And we know which doctors are most likely to be sued. So I'm a general surgeon, and we're at the top of the list. But urology, ENT, OBGYN, specialty surgery like lung surgery, orthopedic surgery, neurosurgery, radiologists, emergency medicine, cardiology, gastroenterology, and anesthesiology are the most likely to be sued. And so most doctors intellectually know that sometime in their career this will happen. Still, when it happens, it is a surprise. Let me just say it like this. There are also places where doctors are more likely to be sued, and here they are. So if you're a general surgeon in Kentucky, you can pretty much plan on it. Now, why is it that doctors are sued? Well, probably the number one reason is the failure to diagnose or a delay in diagnosis. So in the case that I just told you about the nail salon owners, this was a delay in diagnosis. When I was an expert in medical litigation, there had been a patient who wanted to sue her doctors for a delay in diagnosis of her gallbladder cancer that had probably led to her imminent death. Unfortunately, in my expert opinion, this woman did not have a case, But I think that the reason that she approached her lawyers was just to be heard and to be understood. So when I told the lawyer, no, I didn't think she had a case, and I heard more about her story, I did something that I don't often do. I volunteered to come in and speak with this patient and explain to her sort of what happened. So I brought in the anatomy books and I explained to her, how the doctors had actually made logical choices just based on what they knew at the time. And she understood, and afterwards she got up and hugged me and said, "Thank you. I can die in peace." So while there are all of these reasons that people give about why people actually sue other doctors, part of what I think is the reason that patients sue is they just get frustrated because they feel like doctors aren't listening to them. And in fact, when I was reviewing cases of medical negligence, I could often identify an event where the doctor just started ignoring the patient. And had they only listened to the patient, things would be different. In addition, I've spoken with lots of lawyers, and I asked lawyers, why is it that some patients have bad outcomes and they sue and other patients don't? And one lawyer said something interesting. He said, I find that really what patients are most angry about is something about billing. And ultimately, that's why they're filing the lawsuit. So it has nothing to do with the medical care. It has to do with the interactions that they have with the hospital or the office staff about their bill. So they asked, were you surprised at being sued? I was one of those very surprised. Never in my wildest dreams did I ever expect to be sued by this patient. Do you think that the lawsuit was warranted? Well, everyone who reviewed my lawsuit said this is just a frivolous suit, and I'm not alone. About 83% of doctors felt like their lawsuit was not warranted. Having a bad outcome is one thing. And bad things happen. We all know this. We can drive very safely, but if there's a drunk driver who plows into us, it's not our fault, right? And in order to prevail in a medical malpractice lawsuit, there has to be this negligence and the harm directly tied to the negligence. And it can be very difficult for patients to distinguish between those two things. Then they asked, was there a trigger incident that sparked the lawsuit? Okay, for me, I don't recall anything. And most doctors say no. Like if you know that a patient was really angry, if they stormed out of the hospital or, they told you how unhappy they were, well, yes, you might proactively call your medical malpractice carrier and say, look, I think that there is a problem here. But only about a third of doctors are able to identify that kind of episode. Okay, how many hours did you spend on your defense? I personally spent more than 40 hours. Now, this is talking about collecting the medical records, talking with the lawyers. My lawyer sent me to deposition charm school so I would know how to conduct myself. But I will tell you that this lawsuit weighed over me like a cloud. I lost sleep over it. This was something that significantly impacted the quality of my life. How long did the lawsuit take? Well, this can be years and years and years. Mine was over in about 2 years, but it can last a long time. Okay. What ultimately happened with the lawsuit? Well, here are a whole bunch of numbers, but the long and short of it is that if you are a doctor being sued, the odds are in your favor, right? Chances are pretty good that you're not going to go through this long, terrible process and like lose your house in the works. I mean, in general, juries are very sympathetic to doctors. They respect doctors. There are certain kinds of lawsuits that have a big emotional charge, like OBGYNs who have childbirth-related injuries. But in general, doctors are going to do okay. They ask doctors, why do you think lawsuits happen? Well, we already sort of talked about that. Patients blame bad outcomes on doctors because they don't understand medical risks. So in other words, they don't make this distinction between a known risk and harm that was caused by negligence. Patients who were injured from medical error seek restitutions and to assign responsibility. I personally think that a lot of them just want to be heard. They want somebody to just hear, okay, this is what happened to me and my family as a result of this medical error. And by the way, not everyone who's harmed by a medical error seeks a lawyer. Next, lawyers advertise to get new clients. Patients think that they can make easy money. Doctors and hospitals make too many preventable medical errors or something else. But I've got something else that I want to just add to the list. So when I went to medical school, I sort of felt like I was, being groomed as a soldier on the war against death and disease. And it's a zero-sum game, right? You win or you lose. And the losses can be very painful. Every time my patient had a complication or a patient died, I would do a lot of Monday morning quarterbacking. What could I have done differently? And you look at each of these stages. Further, especially surgeons want to learn through the mistakes of others. So we would have weekly M&M meetings, and we didn't get together and eat chocolate-covered candies. We would take a look at the morbidity and mortality. So we would take the case of every patient who had a complication or a death, and we would dissect it publicly so that the whole group could learn from the mistakes of others. Okay, so if you're in a zero-sum game, your patient has a complication. It's a loss, right? And it's painful. And I think it's human nature to try to not constantly be reminded of our losses. So what I have observed is that when a patient has a complication, their doctors don't spend as much time in their room. There's not the same kind of warmth. And I wonder if patients see that kind of withdrawal as an admission of blame or culpability. So if you're a doctor and you do have a patient with a complication, gather your courage. Be willing to be with this patient and hear what it is like for this patient. I think that this act of compassionate listening could potentially prevent a lawsuit from happening. Okay, I will just tell you that most doctors do have medical malpractice coverage. In fact, in order to get hospital privilege, you have to have proof of coverage. Many doctors go without disability insurance, and they probably should not. But medical malpractice is not as much of an issue. Now, the next question is kind of interesting. Did the insurers encourage or require physicians to say, okay, let's just settle? So for doctors, this is a really emotional thing, right? No doctor wants to have a settlement on their record because every time that they apply for jobs, every time that they apply for new hospital privileges, one of the questions that they're asked is, are there any claims against you? So this is emotional. This is about us, about our professional reputation. From the insurance company, though, This is all about numbers, right? They know the kind of investment that they will have to make to defend a doctor in a medical malpractice lawsuit. And they know that in many cases, it's just going to be less expensive for them to settle the case. So some insurance companies really will push their doctor clients to settle. Well, is a doctor required to settle, or can they make their own independent assessment? Well, it sort of depends. What happened as the result of a lawsuit? Probably the most profound consequence is this first one listed here. I no longer trust patients. So for a long time after my lawsuit, I would look at somebody and I would wonder, is this just another patient who is going to sue me? And it was very painful because I always saw myself as my patients' advocates, right? I was there advocating for their own best interest. And when you don't trust patients, you start to have a different kind of doctor-patient relationship. And this relationship is the foundation of the healthcare system. If you go and you create a fire, you know that you just can't have one log. You need 2 logs to build a fire because the magic happens with the gases that are released when the wood heats up. In a similar way, the magic of the healthcare system happens in this relationship between a doctor and a patient. So this really impacted the joy that I could get when I saw my patients. I did, do a lot of work, and I went on to heal from this lawsuit, but it was a long time and it was a hard deal. I have a friend who is a psychiatrist, and she was sued by somebody with borderline personality disorder. And you know that you're working with a borderline if you're dealing with somebody who's always in conflict. Like the patient who sued me, he had borderline personality disorder. He told me about this doctor and that doctor who had done him wrong. So there are always people who have done them wrong. And the interesting thing is that, the person who done them wrong can switch. So in a family dynamic, first the person is mad at, the husband or the wife, then they're mad at the kid. But there's always somebody who's on the outs. There's this black and white thinking. Somebody is either good or they're evil. And so she had on her business card, no borderlines. She would not take on any patients who had borderline personality disorders. There are people who left their practice setting. A buddy from medical school was an ER doctor, and she actually had clinical PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, from this lawsuit, and she left. Some people can change their insurer. Some purchased more malpractice, and some didn't do anything differently. So, the kind of impact that a lawsuit has on doctors is highly variable. Okay, did the plaintiff receive a monetary award? So if the plaintiff prevailed, did they actually get an award? And you see that about 2/3 of patients who get awards, actually 3/4, the award is something that's covered by their medical malpractice lawsuits. So when I was practicing, they would, the insurance company would pay $1 million towards a single award and $3 million, like $3 million awards during that year. So, the things that doctors worry about, the $20 million settlements where they could potentially lose everything, those are very, very rare. So if doctors can sort of take a deep breath when they get sued, when somebody comes and says, here you have been served, probably the most important thing for doctors to understand is, look, you're going to be okay. Chances are good that you are going to prevail. And if you don't prevail, because you never really know what's going to happen with a jury, that you're probably going to be covered. You probably are not going to have to kick in personal assets. Doctors were asked, was the outcome of the lawsuit fair? Half said yes, half said no. I didn't think my lawsuit was fair because I shouldn't have been sued in the first place. I mean, I did get a judgment in my favor, but still, I mean, I think that this guy should have been sued. Like, this guy should have had to pay for my legal fees. That would have been fair. What would you have done differently? Well, doctors definitely should have excellent charting, excellent documentation. They should explain things clearly. You know, be careful about who you accept as a patient. Now, depending on a doctor's practice setting, they may have more or less control over this. You know, if I had to go into the emergency room and see a patient with appendicitis, I couldn't just say, well, I think this person has borderline personality disorder. I'm sorry, find another surgeon. But if you've got a long-term relationship, if you're in primary care or you're a plastic surgeon doing cosmetic work, or you were referred a patient by a primary care doctor, you can definitely say, you know, I don't think that we would be a good fit, and you don't want to abandon a patient. You want to be very careful about this, but you don't have to take every patient that comes your way. They asked, do you think I'm sorry would have made a difference? 82% of doctors say no. 17% said they don't know, and 2% said yes. I think that they kind of missed the mark with this question. I think that the more appropriate question was, did you ever sit down and really listen to what a patient had to say? And I think that that intervention probably would make a difference. I haven't seen any data that actually suggests that was true. Are medical organizations or society doing enough? And, you know, most doctors say no. There are some states that are really doing a good job. So if you are a doctor who has been sued, the first thing to do is take a deep breath and know that you are not alone. Know that whether or not you are a good doctor has really nothing to do with this piece of paper that has been handed to you. And know that you are probably going to be okay financially. So just take a deep breath and know it's going to be okay. You know, every doctor knows that the very first thing that they should do is contact your medical malpractice carrier. The first thing that they will say is don't talk to anybody about this lawsuit, because anybody with whom a doctor speaks could potentially be deposed by the plaintiff. So I had a very, very wise friend, and it just so happened that she knew a lot of women doctors who were being sued. She was being sued herself, and she knew the agony that this had caused. And so she did something absolutely brilliant. She decided to form a consulting group. So all of us got together. We paid each other $1 to be each other's consultant. And this was a safe place where we could talk about what was happening in our lawsuits, how it impacted our lives, and how we could understand this. And this was really the thing that helped me heal most effectively. So if you are a doctor who has been sued, I really recommend that you start something like this. Now, of course, the medical malpractice carriers are going to tell doctors not to mention anything, and most doctors really will not. So you might not know that the person you're sitting next to in the surgeon's lounge was just sued. But especially for women, people sort of know. So you could approach them. You could also approach the lawyer and say, look, this is really hard emotionally, and I'm trying to help other doctors through this. And so if you know any doctors, here's the idea that I have. You could even go to the medical malpractice carrier and pose this idea. If you are a financial advisor who's always looking at ways of offering more value, I think having roundtables for doctors where doctors can get together, talk about the challenges that they are facing, and then come up with solutions together is a great idea. But this particular idea, like a group to support doctors who are going through lawsuits, this is really something that you could add value with. And this could potentially be something that's a great way of generating more prospects. All right, so let us go on to the really, really scary stuff, which is personal injury. So this is like a different kettle of fish. And I think that this is something that as a physician, you should have higher levels of awareness about. And if you are a financial advisor, you definitely want to work with your doctors to protect them. I often quip that I felt like I just had a target on my back that said, sue me. And I think a lot of doctors would get sued. So if somebody has a Christmas party and a guest trips and something bad happens, I think a doctor is much, much more likely to be sued than a teacher is. So let us talk about how to decrease the risk of being sued. And financial services professionals, this is where you can really help your doctor clients by, in essence, creating a moat around doctors' assets. So, if somebody brings a case to a personal injury lawyer, how do you communicate to this personal injury lawyer that it's not just going to be a slam dunk, right? They're not just going to collect $7 million from a dermatologist because those assets are just out there. So setting up the right corporate structure and having the corporate structure sort of own assets, having that be the moat around a doctor's assets is key. Now, this is complicated stuff, right? And I don't claim to be an expert about it, but if you're a doctor, I would highly recommend that you have a member of your dream team who intimately understands how to set these things up, because there are a couple of big advantages. First is the protection against lawsuits, right? But the second is that, at least for right now, for these next couple of years, you could potentially put more money in your pocket by taking advantage of some of the tax benefits of having the right corporate structure. So this new tax law that we had in 2017, it was really intended as a way for America to become a competitor in the global market, because we had really high corporate tax rates. And that potentially, push business away from the US. So with a lower corporate tax structure, ideally more people would be doing business in the US. And so there are laws that doctors can go with. It's sort of like martial arts for taxes. If you go with the momentum of this tax code, then you can legally and ethically, potentially put tens to hundreds of thousands of dollars in your pocket. And done right, this can have a significant impact. I know an orthopedic surgeon who was working with a really sharp team, and he decreased his tax bill by about $900,000 in a single year. And what did he do with that $900,000? Well, he invested that in things that are going to help his community. And that's the general idea about lower taxation. And I'm not an expert on taxes, right? But I can tell you that the argument for our tax law is that it is designed as a form of social engineering to offer incentives for people to engage in activity that will help nations build wealth. And if it's going to help a nation build wealth, it can also help individuals build wealth. Okay, there are some other little tricks that you might want to know about. If you're in private practice, most doctors have a hefty accounts receivables. I know a general surgeon who had about $1 million in accounts receivables. We needed to talk about how she could manage her practice a little more effectively, because that's not a smart thing to do. But if you go to your bank and get a very small loan against your accounts receivables or against your equipment, that means that if there were a judgment against the doctor, the bank would be first in line to collect. So again, this is kind of a way of forming a moat around assets. And then a third factor was illustrated by O.J. Simpson. Now, you might have remembered O.J. like playing golf after there was this civil judgment against him. You know, there was about a $35 million award for the Goldman family, yet they had a hard time collecting, and O.J. was off golfing. How could this happen? Because, you know, lawyers are pretty skilled at collecting awards. Well, what had happened was that a lot of O.J.'s revenue came from his pensions, right? And the pensions are not subject to seizure by creditors or judgments. So if you're a doctor, you know, you might want to think about, you know, are you working with the right people who are going to put your nest egg in a place that is going to be safe in the event that there is a personal injury. Next, have conversations with your teenagers, because as a doctor, you know, if your teenager were in a car accident, chances are very, very good that a personal injury lawyer is going to come after you. Now, I remember my son's teenage years, and I had a lot of compassion for my son. It turns out that when kids enter adolescence, their prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that's responsible for executive function, gets pruned, like literally. And so if you found that, you know, your 10-year-old is suddenly making really bad choices, blame it on their brain. It's just their biology. So the prefrontal cortex will not be fully reformed until girls are about 24 and boys are about 26. So I remember one of the mommies in my mommy group said, just keep them alive till 25. So we know that teenagers are just plain old predisposed to making bad choices. So, you know, parenting experts will recommend things like no sleepovers during teenage years, because they say when you put two teenagers together, each of their IQs cuts in half. You know, watch social media stuff. Just understand that kids' brains aren't what they're gonna be. And, you know, I would have a frank conversation with my son, and if you'll pardon my French, we used to have conversations about not doing stupid shit. So if you're a doctor and you can, you know, work with your teenagers to give them some insight about their brain and then sort of put some protection in the area, that would be great. Okay, but no matter what you do, you know, doctors do run the risk of being sued by a personal injury lawyer. So the best thing to do is just buy insurance. So you minimize your financial losses in the event that you are sued. So there are things that need to be done professionally. There are certain insurance policies that you can buy, professional liability, property insurance, business auto insurance, workers' compensation insurance, business interruption insurance, life insurance, and practice overhead insurance. So let me just give you some more stories just to let you know how important this is. So there were a group of cardiologists, and the cardiologists would buy into the practice. And one of the cardiologists died. He didn't have life insurance, and the widow wanted compensation for his share in the business. Now, had the business not purchased life insurance, all of his partners could potentially have been liable to that widow. I know another group, this was urologists. So the senior urologist, like the rainmaker, had a gambling problem. And he had run at hundreds of thousands of dollars on a corporate credit card gambling. So how do you recover from something like that? I remember having a colleague, she was a breast surgeon. I hadn't seen her in a while. And I started asking around, where is she? And they said, oh, you haven't heard. Her trusted office manager embezzled her entire retirement savings, and it was gone. This woman went into a clinical depression, and she's not operating anymore. So, there are other stories about, let's see one. A doctor was sued for sexual harassment by a patient. And then in this new world, there's all sorts of other risks. I know doctors who have been sued by activity on social media. So when I made my own transition in 2000 from being a surgeon to being an entrepreneur, I wanted to write and speak about healthcare consumerism. But I had this fear of liability. So I went and asked my medical malpractice carrier, what do I do if I'm on the radio or I write a book and I get sued about that? And at that time in 2000, they talked among themselves and decided that any time I was talking about healthcare, I was engaged in the practice of medicine. Yet my medical malpractice carrier, who would insure me to take patients to the operating room, was unwilling to insure me for something I might say over the radio because they didn't know the risk profile. Yet I knew that I had this liability. So what I did is I purchased an errors and omissions policy. So this would protect me from all sorts of things that I was doing and all sorts of activities that I was doing. There's special cyber security insurance that doctors should have. And the thing is, all of this insurance is very, very cheap. HIPAA violations is huge. So let me tell you another story about that. So a practice's office manager took her laptop with her on Hawaii. She had the laptop stolen, which is always a bummer. But the big bummer for the practice was that the practice was doing a clinical study and she had unsecured patient records on that laptop. So the person who stole the laptop could potentially get access to private information, right? There was a $50,000 fine per record that's unprotected. So HIPAA violations can be very, very expensive, and every doctor should be protected. There are theft and employee misconduct, employment practices. So this is not an exhaustive list. I'm not an insurance broker. I'm not here to offer advice about, what could happen. What I am here to say, though, is that this is something that every doctor wants to know about because they work too hard to accumulate assets. It could all be gone in a moment. So this is very important. And then, in addition to protecting the practice, it is really important to, protect your private life. So, something like putting your house in your husband or wife's name, that's not adequate protection. So you want to actually work with somebody who's an expert at this. And there are certain basic things like having an umbrella policy for your home. My own personal bias is I just buy insurance for pretty much everything. I just bought new tires and I didn't buy an insurance policy for the tires because it just didn't make economic sense. But if I could experience some kind of significant loss, I am all in. So the bottom line is that a lawsuit can significantly impact the financial trajectory of a doctor. If you talk with doctors and you hear about their fears, what are they afraid of? Well, they're afraid of like Medicare audits or IRS audits. And by the way, you can get insurance policies for those too. They're afraid of outliving their money and having to move in with their kids. And they're worried about losing it all in the event that they could get sued. Further, these lawsuits can contribute to all sorts of really bad things, like the epidemic of doctor burnout, of worry, about disconnecting from the joy in medicine. So there are some practical steps that doctors and financial advisors can help doctors with in order to really minimize the risk of having this kind of terrible thing happen. So I would be happy to answer any questions that you might have about this. This is sort of the end of my formal presentation. If you are a doctor, by the way, and you would like more tips about how to translate your dream into reality, whether it is understanding your relationship with money better, whether it's ways that I have replaced my surgeon's income with entrepreneurial ventures, please go to Thriving Doctors and sign up for my tips or join my community on Facebook. If you are financial services professionals there to help doctors take control of their financial destiny, I have a separate resource for you. You can go to Engaging Doctors, previously known as Targeting Doctors, sign up and get on my list so you'll learn about educational events like these. My secret sauce is sort of offering a bridge between the world of business and the world of medicine. And so, I help financial services professionals really understand doctors' relationship with money, and in a similar way, I help doctors approach their profession in a more business-minded way to help them get better business results. Okay, so let me just go through some questions. All right. Okay, so somebody asked a great question. Are there any doctors connecting to this webinar from Canada? I'd love to get to know them. And I protect privacy, right? So if you're a doctor who'd be interested in getting in touch with a financial services professional in Canada, please go ahead and send me a message here privately, and I would be happy to make that connection. Can you talk about doctors who are sued personally for non-medical malpractice incidents, such as car accidents, trips and falls at a residence, etc.? I think I gave you some examples of doctors who go over that. Really, the main thing that I am worried about for doctors is the activities of their children. All doctors, have this target on them, And so all doctors should be aware of their risks for lawsuits from a personal injury lawyer. You know, cognitively, there's some dissonance. Like a lot of people are like really scared to fly in an airplane. They don't have any problems driving to the airport, right? Because they drive all day, every day. Statistically, though, what's the highest risk activity? It's this driving. It's not flying on the plane. That's actually pretty safe. So I think helping doctors understand what the true risks are would be a really important contribution. So what are they? But more importantly, what are they doing to make sure that they're not an attractive target, and also to minimize damage in the event that they are sued? Because unfortunately, stuff does happen. Okay, so thank you for the follow-up question about how life insurance can help doctors minimize losses. Okay, again, I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a financial advisor. I don't sell insurance. But what I understand is that insurance companies, certain kinds of insurance companies in certain states, have protection against seizure in the event of a judgment or a claim. So one of the reasons that I have insurance and I like keeping my money in my particular insurance policy has to do with a couple of things. First, it offers tax-free income in my retirement, so I can just borrow from my insurance. But in the event that something terrible happened to me in my state with my insurance, as I understand, my insurance policy could not be seized. So again, this is not advice for doctors. If you're a financial advisor, I'm not claiming to be an expert on it. I'm just explaining why I made a decision in my particular case. Oh, that's so sweet, Thomas. How can we secure an autographed copy of your book? Why don't you go ahead and sign up? How do we sign up for your site? So if you go to targetingdoctors.com, and I will just pull that up so that you can see. On each of my pages, you will see a sign up. So I am rebranding Targeting Doctors as Engaging Doctors. So things are going to look a little different. But if you go to pretty much any page, and let me just go to my blog, you're going to see a sign up form. So once you're on my list, you're going to get weekly tips and tools to help you get higher levels of performance. And I am just going to guess that you are going to ask about other things. So anyway, if you want an autographed copy for yourself or for others, let's talk, because there are ways of doing it. So if you would like to read my books, just go here under Books for Doctors, and you can actually download and read the digital copies of The Myth of the Rich Doctor and the 9 Money Mistakes that doctors make. I'm working on my next one, which is how doctors can basically reinvent themselves and, you know, develop higher revenue streams. But anyway, these make absolutely great gifts for doctors. So if you're looking for a way to get to know new doctors, sending them one of these books have been proven to work, right? And The Myth of the Rich Doctor began as a blog post when I went on vacation. I got back and it had sort of gone viral. So I decided, oh, there's something here. So I expanded it into a book. And I have been all over the United States speaking to groups of doctors about the content of this book. And then I thought, well, wait, if this is working so well for me, maybe it can be a tool for financial advisors. So I offer the opportunity for financial advisors to write a foreword and afterword on the book so that your name would be below mine. And this is probably, you know, in the decade I've been working with financial advisors, this is the single thing that's been most effective. So that is an option too. But you can read these books, download them, see what you think for yourself. Some compliance companies will say yes, some say no. But if you can give it away, I think that this is a great gift. Thank you for your kind comments, Thomas. I very much appreciate it. Drew asks, how much of physician burnout is due to the worry of lawsuits versus workplace conditions and demands? That is a great question, Drew, and I'm just going to give you my own opinion. Well, first of all, I just reviewed 2 Medscape studies back to back. So this is going to kind of be a long answer to your question, okay? And I've got a LinkedIn post about this. There's a blog post on both Targeting Doctors and Thriving Doctors. Okay, doctors took a hit in 2020. And the main reason was that we wanted to make sure that the demand for healthcare services didn't outstrip the supply, right? I mean, we're all at home so that we're all not, getting COVID and passing it around. Well, every time I operated on a patient, we had to have a ventilator. But the ventilators were needed for the COVID patients, right? So elective cases were canceled. So in some states, women with breast cancer had to wait months before they had operations. Okay, those elective cases that were canceled, those were engines that drive the profitability of hospitals and individual practices. So like the biggest employer in Minnesota, the Mayo Clinic, had projected a $3 billion loss for 2020. So they responded with across-the-board pay cuts. So physicians were getting laid off. They were being asked to take salary cuts. Doctors in private practice, many of them saw reductions in income to like 80 to 90%. And if you're in financial services, you've been through business downturns before. You know what to do. But never in a physician's life did they ever imagine the possibility of, having this kind of disruption in salary in the first place. We also know that half of doctors are behind in retirement planning. So this was a tough hit. I'm a fellow of the American College of Surgeons, and I was seeing like crazy things from the college. They convened this practice protection committee, and they hosted this webinar, Economic Survival Strategies for Surgeons. And I mean, this was like science fiction. This was like an alternative reality. And so doctors, they took the financial hit, but they didn't have the tools to deal with it. So in this Medscape compensation study that was just released about a week ago, you saw who was making what on average. They pointed out that virtually all doctors took a financial hit, but then they asked a really interesting question. They said, how long is it going to be before you're back to your pre-COVID income levels? About 40% said within a year, about 40% said 2 to 3 years, about 10% said 4 years or more, and 10% said never. Okay, so just hold that. And then let's go to another 2021 Medscape report about burnout. So burnout and suicide is a huge issue in the medical community. There's been an epidemic of burnout. We've known this for years. The incidence of burnout in 2020 was about the same as the incidence of burnout in 2019. It's about 42%. So 42% of doctors said, yes, I have experienced toxic stress in the past year. About 80% of doctors say that their burnout predated COVID, and about 20% said that the stresses of COVID, are really what triggered them. We lose about a medical school class of doctors to suicide each year. This is a huge problem. And no patient wants to go and see a doctor who doesn't want to be there, who's disconnected of the joy of medicine, right? All right, so in this study, they asked an interesting question. What would you need in order to turn this around? The number one response mentioned by 45% of doctors was higher income to decrease financial stresses. Okay, so it's like a chicken and egg thing, right? So we know doctors have taken a financial hit. It's going to be a while before they recover. And we know that there are a whole bunch of doctors who are experiencing financial stresses. What many doctors do not know is that they are oftentimes leaving money on the exam table. There are some really, really easy ways for them to, generate more income. I mean, just think about the surgeon who has $1 million in accounts receivable. If she would just do a better job of collecting that money, that would alleviate a lot of financial stresses. Doctors in private practice, the insurance companies will reject about 30% of the claims. And then a lot of busy practices never follow up. Well, what if they were able to collect that money by working with an outsourced biller? They could potentially reduce that rejection rate from 30% down to 2 to 3%. And very, very quickly, they could start bringing more money into their practices. What if doctors were working with two true tax strategists, right? Not just a CPA who's a medical historian, but somebody who's familiar with the tax code, so you could sort of do this martial arts thing. I've seen, overwhelming numbers of doctors who are interested in generating passive income through real estate investing. Like there's a whole movement underfoot. So there are a lot of things that doctors can do to sort of get caught up. And, I'm trying to be really aggressive in bringing this hopeful, optimistic message to doctors. And I'm going to anticipate what you're going to ask. Yes, if you're a financial advisor and wanted to bring some of these messages, yes, I am available to do webinars, to speak, and this turns out to be a great marketing tool for you. Okay, so I just want to make sure. Thomas, thank you for your kind words. Okay. Oh, I actually didn't answer your question yet, Drew. Okay, so when burned out doctors in this Medscape survey were asked, like, why are you burned out? Lawsuits were not specifically addressed, but I think that it's sort of one of those deep things that it might not be mentioned. When you're worried about a lawsuit all day, every day, part of your attention pie is always going there. And I think that this worry about lawsuit can sort of tip somebody over the edge. Again, I think that you can heal from the trauma of a lawsuit, but unless you really have a sense of how much it's weighing you down, it's hard to recover. Like, I don't know if you've ever been bothered by like the disorder in your garage, and it's like an annoyance. But there are other more important things. And then you finally organize the garage, you feel so much better. You didn't realize how much that had been bothering you, but once it's taken care of, you see in retrospect. Okay. Okay. Can you contact me to talk about additional resources? Absolutely. So if you go down to the bottom of any page on my website and you're a financial services advisor, you just click here and you can get yourself on my calendar, and please feel welcome to set up a 15-minute consult with me. Some life insurance provide living benefits. Yeah, I mean, I've been working with financial services professionals for a decade, right? And one day I actually sat down and listened to one of my clients about what life insurance does. And I opened up my eyes and I said, you have got to be kidding. Because I always thought of the death benefits of life insurance and just understanding the true power of it, like all of the benefits. And I'm not making a recommendation if you're a doctor. I'm not suggesting that you make the same choices that I make. But what I will tell you is that I took my son's 529 and I bought a life insurance policy. I took the stock that he had gotten in his birth and I bought him a life insurance policy. And I sat him down and I showed him what was going to happen. So by the time he's ready to buy his first house, he could probably have enough to borrow from his life insurance policy for the down payment. I mean, this is extraordinarily powerful. And I keep on asking, people who build wealth, why is it that there is such a limited awareness and understanding among doctors about what life insurance really can do? Thank you so much for investing your time here. I hope that you took away some value. And I think my best tip here from this whole presentation is forming this consulting group for doctors who have been sued. There are a lot of resources for doctors out there, but this is something of really, really high value. And this is also something that sets you apart, right? So you can be providing unique value. All right, so let me know if I can be of further service. Thank you again for your time, and I'll look forward to working with you. Bye-bye, all.